All right, guys, for today's mini Devo, we're going to go back to Genesis 6, 1 and 2 like we did last time. Right out of the gate, there were two key phrases we wanted to focus on. And we actually tackled the first one, the sons of God. And there's also a second key phrase, the daughters of man. So the reading goes like this. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. I mean, as if verse 1 wasn't already fascinating and interesting enough. Now verse 2, it only escalates the intensity. It's fascinating. It comes packed with meaning. It says, when the sons of God, first key phrase, saw the daughters of men, second key phrase. What about them? What about the second group? Because it seems as though they're being contrasted. Not only are they being discussed, but it almost seems as though they're being contrasted as well by the way they're phrased. And it says that the second group, the daughters of man, they were beautiful. And then it closes, the verse closes this way. And they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Meaning, of all whom they chose from that group that was just mentioned. That's the immediate context. Now, I want to challenge you to look at Genesis 1 through 5 because that's the immediate context. And for all practical purposes, that's all the content that we have up to this point from Genesis 1 through 5 because this is chapter 6. Now remember, the sons of God are those who do God's will. They're not perfect. This is after the fall, chapter 3 of Genesis. But they are such that they yearn to do God's will. It's all about God's will. They're not perfect, but they see eye to eye with God. They serve God. They worship God. They follow God. These are those that they yearn to do God's will, or they try their best to. So at this point, each of those 10 instances throughout Scripture may have its own particular definition based on its immediate context. But what I just mentioned to you always applies across the board like a stamp of identification. So keep that in mind. The will of God, those who do God's will. Now they are contrasted, it seems, with the daughters of man. Why? Now let's use and respect our context. Genesis 1, creation week. Genesis 2, creation again from a different perspective, and life right after creation. Beautiful, fascinating narrative. Chapter 3, it's what's known as the fall. Adam and Eve disobeying God and believing the serpent. Chapter 4 is where we find Cain's family line, Cain's lineage or descendants, his genealogy. This is important to point out because it's not till the end of this chapter, chapter 4 in Genesis, that two things take place. Number one, Seth is born, which comes to replace Abel, who Cain murdered. And number two, the very last verse tells us that at this time, men began to call on the name of the Lord. And right away, chapter 5 comes in, and now the line, the family, the genealogy of Seth is given. So, in other words, what is the context of chapter 6? The two main families that up to this point exist on earth. Cain's family, Cain's lineage, Cain's descendants, his genealogy is given, and Seth's family, Seth's lineage, Seth's descendants, his genealogy in chapter 5. These are the two families that we know up to this point. And chapter 6 introduces in verse 2, the sons of God, those who call on the name of the Lord. Remember the last verse in chapter 4 of Genesis? And then the second key phrase / the second group, the daughters of man. What is the other group other than the sons of God on the earth at this point? The family of Cain. Remember, this is all about God's will, which means if the sons of God do God's will and they're described, pointed out as such, then the other group whom they're contrasted with, and we only know the other family, Cain's family, and we know they don't follow God. They don't do God's will. As a matter of fact, they're proud in their rejection of God's ways. And that's the only other group that is mentioned next to the sons of God, which is the daughters of man. Someone may ask, why is it then, Pastor, that the sons of God, if they yearn to do God's will, if they see eye to eye with God, if they're on the same pitch with God, if they serve God, if they worship God, why do they go seek and find wives from among the daughters of man, Cain's family? Why? So at this point, we have identified two families, Cain's family, Seth's family. We have identified the descendants, the lineage, The genealogy of Cain, those who do not see eye to eye with God, who do not follow or serve God, they don't seek to do God's will. And also Seth's family, his descendants, his genealogy, his family, those who seek and yearn to do God's will. Only 2 of them. And now they come together on verse 2 of chapter 6. We will talk more about this. My question to you is, why do you think if the sons of God are those who do God's will, who yearn to do God's will, to seek to serve God and to please God, why do they go after the descendants of those who do not see eye to eye with God, who do not seek to please God, who do not yearn to do God's will? Why? Isn't that ironic or contradictory? Doesn't that go against their character DNA? What is going on? We'll talk about that. You take care. God bless you. See you next time.